You're listening to the Faith and Order series, hosted in collaboration with the National Council of Churches in the United States, alongside the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University.
This is Michael Reid Trice, Director at the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. And today I'm speaking with Aleksandar Santrac as a part of our Faith and Order series. Dr. Santrac is a minister in the Seventh-Day Adventist Church tradition. And yes, we're talking about faith and order, and we're discussing the nature of pause or Sabbath, how important that is for our lives, and how much we need relationships that connect us to our communities, to our sense of ourselves, to the values that shape who we are every single day. We talk about those experiences in our students as well. So I encourage you to join us and take a listen. So Aleksandar, it's Professor Santrac, right?
Yeah, pastor and professor, yep.
Yeah, pastor and professor. And you have been, as I understand, a minister for a number of years at a Seventh-Day Adventist Church. You've also taught in the university in philosophy and philosophical ethics. Mm-hmm. You've been teaching now in different university contexts. Could you tell us about that and then say a word about how long you've been a member of the Faith and Order Commission?
Good. I've been a member from 2018 until now, enjoying the fellowship and community with you guys there. Mm-hmm. I'm fully endorsed by the North American Division of Seventh-Day Adventists as an observer to Faith and Order Committee. Though Tony was always very welcoming, say, not observer, there's only membership there. Mm-hmm. But right now, the Adventist Church is on its transition towards ecumenical understanding of psyche of what it means to be an ecumenical.
I'm going to come back to that, ask you about that in a minute. Yeah.
Yes, I'm in that process, teaching at two Catholic universities at Maryland, and also pastoring full-time two churches, two congregations in West Maryland. Mm-hmm. In my free time, doing my third PhD in higher education leadership. So pretty busy days these days, you know.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know how you find time to sleep. But you're teaching at two Catholic universities. You're ministering as well. Mm-hmm. You're completing your PhD, and you're a part of Faith and Order. And as you mentioned, the Seventh-Day Adventist Church is it reconfiguring its relationship to ecumenism? You mentioned something about that.
They always had official documents in relation. They configure what they believe and what we as Adventists believe throughout the history of Adventism. Mm-hmm. But right now, I think we are closer and closer to ecumenical understanding of Christ, of eschatology, partially, of ecclesiology, of church discipline. Our main contribution might be, as we will talk in this conversation, is probably the Sabbath, because Seventh-Day Adventists, right, should more or less be something there about the Sabbath, but I'll connect that to some other ideas I have.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that. And I think it's an interesting time to be a part of the Faith and Order work. And I think the listener in this series will have a sense of the kinds of projects in the Faith and Order Commission. But could you say something as well about, since 2018, the kind of work you've been doing on the Faith and Order Commission? What's been of interest? Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'm enjoying the fellowship and community. I like the emphasis on theological humanism or humanistic theology aspect. That's kind of a new development for me, though I did some work on Bonhoeffer. I've been doing some work on Bonhoeffer, so I understand that theological humanistic aspect. I enjoy exchange where all other representatives of the mainstream churches and other, not so mainstream like Latter-day Saints, I think they are not still there, but who is there? The church science, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, right.
Yeah. So this fellowship and community of saints, of Christians, of leaders of the groups, I really appreciate. We had a lot of exchanges, not just at the official meetings, but also at our well-known famous dinner time, right?
Yeah.
Saturday evening or whatever was the time. I'm sad to hear that it's again on Zoom. It might be that people are still afraid of the Omicron going around. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But my contribution was in the group about common humanity. So when I use the concept of common humanity, I don't really think only in ethical terms. I think we need a theological justification, or let me say the transcendent element of theological justification of what common humanity means. Mm. Because you can look at the common humanity from theological, humanistic perspective, but that might be primarily ethical or moral perspective. I think we should look at humanity as within the transcendence framework, what it means to be human in relation to divine. Even the secular people, atheists, they actually frame human being and human structure in relation to something. All right, it's history, it's culture, it's always human being in relation to. It's never just what is human being as I see it. It's never really bluntly my perspective on human being. It's always contextual. So I believe that this incarnational model of contextuality might work as a common humanity model. Christ incarnated is the role model of what it means to be human. And that's why we need transcendent element. I'm a bit afraid that maybe National Council of Churches, if we become too politicized, forget this transcendent element of incarnational model.
That's really interesting. Let me ask you a question about this as you're continuing. I want to hear more about this, but let me just make sure the listener has a sense also of the impact, as I understand it from what you're saying. If ethics is reduced only to what's good for me and for my own life, a kind of philosophical solipsism, right? If it's just about my own good with a small g there, and I'm not thinking about the larger moral fabric with the big G, capital G, good, then, and in relationship, then what's the threat there? Do you think, whether it's in relationship to the transcendent God or in relationship to the neighbor or in relationship to how I see myself taking up residence in the world? I mean, what's the threat if I can't see outside myself?
Very good point. I've been teaching ethics for some years, and we've been going through ethical theories, ethical principles, rules, obligations, mandates. I believe that in the strictly contextual model, these mandates, principles, or good or bad or right and wrong are not very helpful, as Bonhoeffer recognized. We need that immediate submission to the immediate will of God, and you can come to that point only by transcendent presence of God. God knows who are his. We know God. God is love. If God is love, if God is grace, then he's actively involved in humanity. Not like in deism, he created and left us alone. He's actively involved. And because of that, I believe that ethics works with this immediate submission to the will of God model, especially in the context, what to do with Ukraine right now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can exhaust all the ethical theories and principles and mandates and whatever, and you may come to nothing because you don't have a transcendent framework of what to do.
Yeah.
We don't want to go to Abraham's story, Abraham and Isaac and so on. It's a very weird story for most of the atheists and for most of the Christians too. But we can say that transcendence of ethical principle model is needed now, especially in this context.
Yeah.
That's what Bonhoeffer needed for tyrannicide aspect with Hitler. That's what we need now, assassination of Putin and blah, 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 the whole story. Right. We don't need that, but we need something contextual in order to solve this problem, which might be pretty radical sometimes.
And so the listener knows that this theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was a prominent 20th century Lutheran German theologian who ultimately was murdered, lost his life at the hands of the Nazi regime.
Paid the ultimate price for his activism.
Yeah.
So that model of common humanity comes from this transcendent element. But the other side of that story is that it primarily works in the context. So we need spiritual contextual model of thinking and action. I can say more about thinking and action later, maybe.
Sure. So this is important because as you're mentioning, the sinews of this, the common part of this, the sense of our humanity at a time where, apparently the Western moral tradition taken as a whole, in your reference to Ukraine, is not able to stop the moral monstrosity of one individual who has his sights set on a civilian population in Ukraine.
Yeah, it might not be just one individual. It's a whole system in the East and how the East thinks. But I don't think we have a ready platform of the module of solution of this problem. The conflict will be deeper because those who are seeking for solutions, I don't think they're seeking them on the appropriate ground.
Okay.
And that's a big issue with National Council of Churches. If you are just one of the religious politicized institutions, you are not really contribute to progressive and to creative solutions that the world might need now.
Well, and I think that goes to your point. So I interrupted you. Why don't we talk a little more about what you're seeing, some of those creative solutions that you're bringing to the Faith and Order Commission around our sense of common humanity?
Yeah, as I said, common humanity needs to be looked from transcendent perspective, not just immanent. From the immanent perspective, we're always tied to culture, tied to race, tied to gender, ideology. We have the same race in Russia and the US white majority, but it's a different ideology, historically capitalism, communism, and so on. I would love to see human being primarily from its foundations, what it means to be human from a transcendent perspective. And when I say transcendent, I mean Christ-like, the one who is incarnated. So the incarnational model will give us that model of what humanity needs to become, to be and to become. The other contribution that you might like from Seventh-Day Adventism is the role of the Sabbath. You see, the Sabbath is tied to creation, right? And the creation is tied now to activism of eco-justice.
Yeah.
So I think that the National Council of Churches should explore this topic much more because it's in papal encyclicals. It goes ahead with the Catholic social ethics, but it's also an Adventist contribution because this weekly Sabbath that we literally keep is the reminder of that creation aspect, but it's also a reminder of the future of the eco-justice.
Let me frame this in a little different way too, because I want to make sure I understand also the value of this gift ecumenically that you're naming, and that the listener has a sense of, let me say a few things and tell me if I've got this right or redirect, okay?
No problem.
In a time where we're fast-paced and everything's kind of moving, and I can hardly believe what month we're in right now. It just has sped, this year has sped by. And we're in a state where the whole concept of pause, like we all need it on the other side of this pandemic. We're still in the midst of the pandemic. We have other crises taking place. We need these kinds of pauses, holy pauses, Sabbath, a time to step away. And people we know are interested in spiritual direction. Many are going on pilgrimages or journeys. We know that there's a mental health crisis in this country and in parts of the world. I mean, this is happening around us. And you come from one of the few communities I know that actually points to the Sabbath and says that's a window for how we understand our health and well-being.
Absolutely.
Why is that the case? What does that window afford us? If we went through that window, what would that do for the world?
I really appreciate your emphasis on this individualistic aspect of the well-being, right? You pause, you rest.
Yeah.
However, there is a communitarian aspect of the Sabbath. We pause, we rest, and we are one with nature. The whole nature actually pauses. And the whole nature worship God, and the God is glorified in nature from the book of Psalms, from the Genesis at the beginning, the whole creation praises God and so on. So the Sabbath is God related, not human related. Again, I'm mentioning that transcendent element versus humanistic immanent element, which is also very important. We need to pause and rest, but we can do that on Friday and Wednesday. We don't need to do that Sabbath. Sabbath is a specific emblem or a specific symbol in which God says, well, you rest with me because I rested, because I created,
Yeah.
And when I created, I rested. That means the nature and eco-justice becomes so critical because you need to become one with what I created. Is that the case for humanity right now? No, obviously no. So that contribution of communitarian Sabbath is in papal encyclicals, not just in Adventist teaching. This would be a paradox to relate Pope to Adventism, because Adventism has a strong eschatology about the end times and the role of papacy and all of that, which I, as ecumenical Adventist, don't endorse much, but you can hear around, different eschatology. So this, between Sabbath and eschatology, there's also a connection, but I would put emphasis on communitarian or fellowship aspect of the Sabbath, not just between human beings, but between the cosmic, natural elements and humans.
Does your community allow for Seventh-Day Adventism? Can I say, if I spend my Sunday working out in the garden, I'm a part of a community, I have my family, I spend some hours out in the garden, I'm close to nature, or I'm doing something that's connected to the earth, that too is participating in the plural form.
Of course. Yeah, that element is spiritual. You cannot It's reluctance to assess the churches who are not really keeping the literal Sabbath like Jewish community. We're keeping the literal Sabbath like Jewish communities. But still, it's different from Jewish Sabbath because it's Christ-centered, right? It's again, the unique Christ-centered Sabbath related to creation and equal justice. I think you can find that only in maybe I'm wrong, in the Seventh-Day Adventist community.
Well, in this sense, you're mentioning this word incarnational, and I think it's important for the listener. This word in particular, the kind of indwelling that kind of access in history, the inbreaking in the Christian theological heritage, between the divine and the human, and this sense of the indwelling of the love of God in the world. I think when I hear you use that word incarnational, I think what in some ways you're telling me and the listener as well, like God's drawing close. God draws close every day, and a time where you can connect with that intentionally in the business of our lives is in that Sabbath. Where are we now on the other side of a pandemic? Do you sense people are pretty iron poor, exhausted?
Absolutely. People are exhausted, apathetic, indifferent. It's very hard to move people towards a common goal. Both the churches and my students. My students are
I see that in my students as well.
Real crisis. Yeah, higher education is in real crisis.
Yeah.
So we need to help them, to motivate them with these two basic concepts. Common humanity, common goal.
Yeah.
We're all one towards what goal, right?
Yeah.
And pause and rest. Reflection, contemplation. Going into yourself, finding God inside of yourself, not just outside of yourself, with this common humanity and so on. So I'm trying to teach them these two principles that, you may have balanced life, though we teach Plato and Aristotle, and they did believe in balanced life, of course.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But this is important too. I mean, I imagine thinking of you, Alex, in the classroom, in the congregation, in the Faith and Order Commission, and in other contexts, working on your third doctorate. In all of those contexts, if you were asked, yes, a sense of human connectedness and of the value of community, what do you hope for? Like, what are the kind of crystalline, I might say virtues? What are the values? What are the kind of out on that horizon? You mentioned eschatology, things to come, out on the horizon of things that should matter to human beings today. What do you say? This is it. This is where we're going. What do you think? How do you respond to that?
That's a good point. Relating to pragmatic approach to philosophy and the theology here in the US, I can respond to something like that. In this dialogue, we need to create a platform of dealing with cultural, political issues, whether it's racism or gender role or war or, gun control, whatever it is, a current issue, more with thinking than acting. Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher, says, the West is act too fast and too much. We need to stop, reflect, think, and then act.
Yeah.
I think this probing elements of culture is forcing us in the Ecumenical Council to act too swiftly.
Say more about that.
Just to jump into a political arena, to be an activist, and to defend some values which are not clearly reflected upon, we're not going through the thought process, especially spiritual process, what it means. I'm talking about racism. I'm talking about gender role. That's why we have two groups and hard polarizations, because people are just jumping into a camp of cheering like a cheerleader, right? I'm on that blue or red or whatever side I am on. I'm asking my students, what is the common political ground for US? What it really means to be an American?
Yeah.
I don't know. There's no answer. That's my concern.
So what does that say about the sense of a social contract or a communitarian well of being?
There is no bridging between these polarizing groups.
Yeah.
They cannot find a common ground. So I'm reading Constitution to them. I'm reading the parts of the Bible. Is this Christian nation? Is this, deistic nation? What are the grounds? Whatever are the values from the original documents? Okay, they need to read those documents more, obviously. But some of them react and say, oh, yeah, we do have some grounds like liberty and justice and democracy and, all of that. But it's not thought through thoroughly.
Yeah.
People are just jumping into it. I'm pro, against abortion. Yeah, you didn't even read the basic documents ethical about abortion and you are going and shouting on the street. It's weird to me. It's strange to me. But for some people, that's quite natural way of political life,
Well, to your point, I remember seeing a movie. I can't remember the title of it. It wasn't too long ago, but it was in a futuristic kind of dystopian setting where there were two human beings speaking with one another. And if the listener could see me, I'd put speaking in quote marks because they're yelling at each other in these very truncated Facebook, kind of almost meme-like, you only get 30 words,
Exactly.
30 letters. But they were yelling at each other because what had happened is public discourse 200 years out in this movie had been reduced to this frantic, alarmed, self-righteous shouting match that somehow counted for public discourse. And what was missing, I think, is everything you've been talking about, that sense of communitarian well-being, the sense of the tendons that connect us to one another, dialogue, values that we might hold in common, and maybe a relatively strong empathy IQ, but fundamentally a recognition that the person across from me is not my opponent or adversary, or even worse, is not an object. They're a subject. They have values.
Absolutely.
They're a part of a community that's rooted somewhere. And it's in both of our mutual interest that we learn about what's shaping both of us and about what you mentioned, the major challenges of our day.
Yes, exactly, Mike. I think that the reason for that is the lack of what I call ideological linguistic skills. Language that will communicate your ideology in a clear sense. You speak to secular people are not interested in religion anymore, but we religious people did not find the appropriate linguistic patterns and framework to teach them the value of religion. Miroslav Volf was trying that, right? And some other guys from Yale and some other institutions. I was blessed to work with Volf on my book relating to that issue.
Yeah, tell us the title of that book, by the way.
It's Witness to Life Worth Living.
Good.
It's a Greek concept in a Christian context. You see, life worth living is a Greek concept, but witness to is a kind of a transformation from above that can help you to lead your life worth living. So with all my experience, it's personal with Christ, of course.
Witness to Life Worth Living. Got it.
Yeah, that book is also about some of my Christian discipleship journey.
Good.
Yeah, so Volf tried to find that language, right? It's very hard to find it. Speak to secular people, they will always judge exclusivity, right? You're too exclusive, you're too radical. You want me to say that something is wrong, which is not wrong for me. Secular people cannot admit the wrongness of an action that we put in our own frameworks, right? Or sinfulness or whatever. So we need to find another language. I'm grappling with this in my classrooms. Almost 70 to 80% of students who come to Catholic campus are atheists, or they don't really attend the church regularly. They don't read the scripture. They don't pray. So their mindset is actually secular. So how you reach them and explain Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and, even Plato and Aristotle, it's through different language. My whole life is this bridging the gap, I think, between seculars and Christians for my vocation,
I wonder also, you and I share that in common in terms of, vocationally and professionally, in terms of being both ministers and professors. And I think what I notice in students is yes to bridging, but also there's this tremendous capacity to be creative, but maybe in some ways, an untrained capacity for entertaining the possibility of the metaphysical, right? Like there's something more than what's reducible to just the material of life all around me. And that the deepest relationships around love, you mentioned Augustine, or a sense of duty and responsibility, or like the deepest sinews that connect all of us are actually in the capacity to use that imaginative apparatus in that way. And theology and philosophy have been elemental in helping shape that. Take that out, and we become kind of brittle thinkers.
Yeah, true.
So where are you with, if you could say, faith and order is important, here's what I want us to do next. Maybe you've already said it. You've mentioned eco-justice. You've mentioned a kind of reaffirmation of the role of Sabbath.
Yes. Search for meaning in a new context.
Let's talk about that. Where do you see that?
A search for meaning in a new context means in a new situation. It looks like pre-Third World War now. So what kind of ethical concepts we bring to the table? They might collapse all. So we need that immediate reflection on the immediate will of God. You need a prophetic element. I always understood National Council of Churches as prophetic. I don't know about you, but it has to have this prophetic element of proclaiming to the society what we need to do next in terms of immediate will of God.
Oh no, I always felt that too. But it's, I think what to your earlier point, this understanding of the prophetic often gets reduced to what's my next social justice platform, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than asking ourselves what's the true being and role of the prophetic, which is typically the voice, the heralding voice that's standing atop the ruins. And for those who haven't stood on top of ruins, you can go to any number of small cities in Ukraine right now and see plenty of ruins. Now, I don't mean that to sound like I'm taking advantage of the situation of people's lives, but atop the ruins, there's a lot of trauma. People experience massive trauma amidst the ruination of everything that they've had around them. The normalcy, predictability, calculability of life just gets absolutely decimated. And that too is a traumatic reconfiguration of the universe around you. It's in those moments that the prophetic voice is a reminder you're not alone.
Our own uncertainty, as you said, is decimated. We look at the uncertainty of God. God is uncertain.
Yeah.
There is a take of risk in faith, right? In believing.
Yeah.
So this is actually the good time to come back to God, who is love and whose action is uncertain, but whose nature is love.
Yeah.
So you can always have that blessed uncertainty, as Oswald Chambers says, the blessed state of uncertainty, where you can walk in faith with God.
Well, and some people may say, okay, that's all well and good, Professor, but, there's a lot of suffering in the world. And this God of love, who also is in a position of power, maybe I've misunderstood what those two look like together, but I don't understand how that God is active in the world.
That was the language I was speaking about. You need a big picture to understand who God is or why he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah.
The key question for students and members should be why. If you're involved in pro-abortion campaign or pro-life, why? And the student that I confronted them with the question, why? They cannot answer. That's the meaning of your action. That's the thinking of your action or pre-action thinking, which is not there. So that's why I'm saying, with a problem of evil, let's stop, let's reflect, let's look inside of ourselves, let's look at nature again, and see if there is a God of love. And if there is a God of love, then you can look at these atrocities and pain in a completely different way in the framework of a big, big picture that you and I, like in the book of Job, right?
You're right.
Cannot clearly see because we are limited. But that's not a typical answer. I also try to find the language that secular understand about the problem of evil, which is harder than it looks. But that's the only way to reflect on these deep issues.
Yeah, and just, so the listener has a sense of this. I know you've thought long and hard about this. I wrote my doctorate work on how we understand structural cruelty and a philosophical understanding of
very good
of cruelty. And I think that's well said. It's not a theological or philosophical dodge to say we have to spend time with this question. It's to say, actually, that the problem of evil is a significant issue and problem, and it takes a lot of time to think it through because we know, right, listener, in our lives, it can be so deeply impactful. And whether you call it evil or distortion or pain, it is impactful.
But you can understand it only by this existential participation, and that's all the book of Job is about. God gave him the honor and the opportunity to existentially participate in what he went through at the cross. Afterwards, or even before the creation, the lamb was slain, right, for the world. So whatever God was going through, he actually gave honor to Job to participate. Only through that participation comes that knowledge.
Yeah, I think that, my reading on that, just so we're talking about this briefly, is, Job is, I think you're right. There's, as we know, the answer to most of life's really, really complicated questions means we have to participate. We have to wallow in. And as a very good colleague and friend of mine, a Buddhist venerable, once said to me not too long ago, the most beautiful flower, the lotus flower, requires a lot of muck to grow. You have to it grows in that context of a lot of muck. And I think that's very much Job's life. It doesn't mean it's painless. It just means he is able to discover his responses to what's happening to him by virtue of being in participation with the living question and with those around him, including God. Let me ask one other question about the prophetic, as you mention it. So you've said, and I think the listener would agree, we are in a time of significant geopolitical upheaval. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of good we can see in our lives too. Local communities are reaching out and working with one another. Yeah, we know that, but we also know that we don't have to look on the other side of the world for the kinds of conflicts that are taking place around us. We can see that in a supermarket or in a church when someone walks in with a weapon.
Oh yeah, that's such a tragic incident.
Right. So here's my question for you. What is the nature of the prophetic as you're thinking about it? What's the work that needs to be done in faith and order in the next couple of years to have this conversation that you think is of such value?
Maybe to recognize where the true dictatorship lies in the world.
Okay.
Maybe not trusting fully what media currently says. I don't want to sound pro-Trump because this is not a pro-Trump expression. Right. It's just from my personal experience and experience in my homeland and here. It's obvious that you cannot trust fully the media. So maybe we should reflect first, right? Think first and then act, right? Reflect first, where is the true dictatorship really lies? And who is controlling our lives to the extent that we cannot even express ourselves in Christian beliefs and terms in this country anymore, which was founded on Christian principles. This is a great paradox of U.S. development, evolution, and culture of United States, because this is National Council of Churches. It's related to U.S. culture and history. That's my suggestion. And then cry out at the rooftops, as you said, about these basic principles of equality, equity, justice, and all of that, but related to a genuine situation, understanding of what really is happening. That would be a long process of discussing not really who is behind evil. That's not a point. We know that evil is evil. Sometimes evil is done even by good people, Yeah. But the point is that you cannot target and you cannot be an activist against something you don't understand. That's my fear.
Maybe one final word is, I think of the Hungarian poet Madách Imre, his work on a long poem on the human being. I forget the title now, but it's it's a dense volume. And I tell students so much, Alex, aligned to what you've said. To say it again is almost repetition, but what I do tell them is understand your own worldview. What do you think of humanity? What do you think of the transcendent or God or mystery and awe of the universe? What do you think of the world? Have a coherent understanding morally, existentially, and don't settle for a kind of partial view of the cosmos. It doesn't mean you know everything. It doesn't have to be exhaustive to be coherent, but you owe it to yourself to know why it is you believe what you do and what you stand for. And I hear you saying that, and I look forward to our continued work in faith and order. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you for organizing this fruitful dialogue. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter. To learn more about the National Council of Churches in the U.S., visit them at nationalcouncilofchurches.us.